So localization in itself, actually, with regards to making the humanitarian assistance more efficient and really deliver for the affected population, it combines the possibility of efficiency, accountability gains, of financial, political, and power balance shifts. It's called more support and funding to local and national responders. Much of those discussions had focused on this funding issue. And for many, they had this kind of narrow view that localization is just all about more direct funding to local and national actors. I think it's also important to to not forget the other half of that statement around this as local as possible and international as necessary towards the commitment to delivering principled humanitarian action. And secondly, and this one, the kind of another sort of famous tagline on localization that came from Grand Bargain, which is more, personally, I think it kind of takes a step further, and it's more acceptable, and it's more transformative, especially in the perspective of local actors themselves, is this notion of reinforcing rather than replacing. The 6 Grand Bargain commitments can be divided, as far as the workstream is concerned, into these 4 dimensions or areas. So capacity strengthening, partnership, coordination, and financing. Among the kind of work streams of the Grand Bargain, I think localization is the one that's been both very ambitious and, of course, contentious. So there's a lot of discussion. As I mentioned earlier, the focus at the early stages was just this issue on funding. And then there was this, and then the first stage towards delivering that commitment was first agreeing on the concept of who is local and national. So it kind of course, opened a big kind of worms of who is a national and local actor. So there is also an issue, of course, of the baseline. So, of course, with different mandates and objectives of different Grand Bargain signatories, they're starting from a different, different baselines. So how do you measure the progress? Especially that highlighted in the last independent report of the Grand Bargain is that there is no clear end goal for localization. So the work stream is composed of the different focal points from the different Grand Bargain signatories, so across the donors, UN agencies, international NGOs, and then we realize we're missing the most important actor in the room, the local actors themselves. So the work stream now we have invited 10 local actors, not just organization, but representative of local actor networks. This should not be confused with locally led response, because that is already happening, has been happening, and is delivering results. Localization is for the international system to recognize, to respect, and support these locally led responses so that it delivers to the affected population. And then for the last 2, it's about local actors themselves, claiming that space and changing the narrative from not just with the definition of localization, but these issues on capacity strengthening. What is this as local as possible international assistance? What is complementarity? It's about, so there's this space now in the Grand Bargain localization workstream for local actors to really kind of speak for themselves. Because again, of course, it's not a very homogeneous, and we are still international actors, especially also northern actors, also kind of tendency to speak on behalf of national local actors. I think there's a need to kind of change that the kind of practice. The Red Cross as a movement, as a family, at the main objective in a response to an emergency is how best to deliver a principled humanitarian action most effectively, more quickly, and efficiently. And what will be the best role, what is the comparative advantage of each of these movement partners, not just in the kind of like immediate response, but in different stages of the emergency. So where one may have to take in a bigger role, and one may have to step back as the context changes. So we say that localization is fundamentally how we work. It is in the Red Cross DNA. Because at the center of the work of the Red Cross are the national societies. So what we call internally as the host national societies. So complementarity is about it refers to the interaction and to the comparative advantages between those different movement partners and how do they all are being taken into account.
At first, so ALEF is a human rights organization. So we work in Lebanon since 1996 on documenting and advocating on human rights. So because we're a human rights organization, sometimes localization or the Grand Bargain comes a bit weird or doesn't make sense because traditionally human rights work has been always supported in a localized way. Localization. So the way we see localization is not only through funding opportunities or funding tracks, but basically to have the dialogue and the engagement between local actors, donors, and aid organization is taking place. And I think this is in a nutshell the most important part, the way we see it. The way to enhance that could be through the form of strategic planning. One way to solve that is to bring local organizations, make them part of the strategic plan, and make them actually influential to the headquarters strategic vision. It's also looking at to work with organizations not just through projects or programs, but at the institutional level. Another good example also ALEF has is with PAX, a Dutch organization. We started working together in 2004. It actually was our first donor. And because from 2004 up until 2019, we only maybe got twice a project together, but all the rest is constant engagement, constant follow-up. They invite us to lobby meetings. We work together on their strategy on Lebanon and the rest of the Middle East. What is important is actually to lead a discussion with local organizations because we do have challenges. We don't have the same capacities. And we actually, sometimes it needs a bit of patience on how actually it can actually reach good results. Like in Lebanon, refugees sometimes don't just want to see their access to residency in Lebanon solved. They don't just want to see livelihood opportunities. Sometimes they just want to send their children to school. Sometimes they just want livelihood opportunities so they can be autonomous. So it's very important that the priorities in the field could be sometimes different from the priorities in the headquarters. And sometimes it's difficult to convene the message because of the funding cycles, because of the difficulties in reaching out to people. The other thing is capacity versus expectations. Whenever somebody localizes, we cannot expect the same result as an organization that has 12 offices around the world and 1,300 staff that can be able to do things the same way that they are being done. So when somebody is working with ALEF, they need to expect that we are 7 people. The problem is it's very difficult to really match expectations with capacities. And this is really important to do. When somebody flies from Denmark to Lebanon to work at an organization, they're traveling for work. And it changes a bit the mentality. It's fine. They might be working 16 hours a day and take 1 week vacation and all that. But for us, we live in Lebanon. Like we have a lot of social networks to maintain, a lot of obligations to do. And we're not in Lebanon to work. We're in Lebanon because we live there, and our engagement with the situation in Lebanon is out of a realization of the needs. So the accountability and compliance when it comes with localization is certainly something very difficult, and someone needs to design better structure. What Oxfam has in matter of accountability and compliance is very difficult to include in an organization. Being able to monitor and deal with big funds, deal with communities, it does require a stronger accountability and compliance. And this is where we need the experience of international NGOs and aid organizations in helping us develop those compliance mechanisms. What we have is basically good enough to what we expect is good enough, but it might not be good enough in order to be leading on our own. But sometimes it's irrelevant for us, for example, to have a compliance officer when we're only a staff of 6. And when somebody is going to look at our internal bylaws and see you don't have a compliance officer. Well, we don't need a compliance officer. We're just 6 people. The other challenge is, I'm always speaking in the lens of an NGO, but where do communities stand when we speak about localization? NGOs are important, but sometimes we need to bypass NGOs and reach out to communities. And sometimes sitting in capitals, it can a bit confuse us who is a local NGO and who represents communities. The working environment can be different, and staff retention. And we go back to the level of capacity building to also maintain the staff experience. Or else every 2 years, a local NGOs face a crisis. And I'm going to tell you very, very openly, I was never able to take a vacation because of constant change in staff. Because staff constantly change because they get a much more competitive salary and benefits from other organizations. That for us is very difficult to retain. And whenever a staff has the capacity to actually deliver and be able to actually be managing the work pretty well, we end up losing the staff. And so the expertise is there. But the problem with us as local NGOs, we haven't been able to retain this experience. There is a need to work long term for localization to be effective, and in order to test the capacities and in order to test the mechanisms that are in place and test the accountability structures that are in place, we need to work on a long-term basis. So not just support organization directly, but maybe help us to find the support that we need, and not just give money in a way that it is localization, but also open doors to influence donors, open doors to influence not just donors in the financial mean, but in the strategy of the donors. Try to bypass fundraisers. Localization discussions in the lens of sometimes local NGOs is always of, this is an opportunity for funding, and we do a fundraising pitch to the donors or to the INGOs that are there. Localization is not an exit strategy, and this is also very important. In the case of Lebanon, at least, I don't know in other countries, a lot of organization at looking at localization, sometimes it confuses with exit strategies. How should we leave the country? Because now there's other humanitarian crises elsewhere, and let's do localization so that we look good by doing exit strategies.
I'd like to take you through a journey of what localization in practice possibly could be. And I'll be sharing this from the experience of a collaboration of international and national organizations that came together under a project called Shifting the Power. When we started the project, we were addressing the imbalance that does exist in the humanitarian system and acknowledging that it is currently skewed in favor of international organizations. But there's an effort that has been going on within a number of organizations to support national organizations and also frontline responders. So this was the vision of the project, looking at transforming the humanitarian agenda by shifting power to local organizations, and local here being primarily national. In terms of what we're achieving, it's looking at the speed, quality, and effectiveness of the humanitarian system, and also for them to be able to play a leadership role, which is about facilitation of affected voice to be heard. Really, when you're talking about who leads and who makes the decision, if our role as organizations, whether national or international, is not going to facilitate the voice of those affected to be heard, I believe we then are not taking forward localization. To broaden the discussion again around resources, there was all this discussion, what is power? Definitely money came in fast, but really we broadened this and agreed in terms of local context, in our case, local context, being accountable, there's technical capacity, then staff money and many others. And then at national level, one of the key things that was key to this process is the structures for coordination at national level, primarily being led and coordinated by the national governments together with the international governments. So how are local organizations, how are local communities, national organizations being supported, or are they sitting in those spaces where the coordination of humanitarian work is being discussed and decisions being made? Then just a few in terms of the tenets that we agreed at the international level. The biggest one was about confidence in national and international systems. George has just alluded to that in terms of local organizations exist and have a different form of existence, but it's for us to invest and show that confidence that we do have in those organizations. Might not mean changing, rather it's about using our representational role as international organizations to give space to national organizations. What commitments are we making as we come to international forums? At ActionAid, part of the commitments that have been done is that for every international space where localization is being discussed, it is a commitment to have one of the key speakers being a woman, and also coming from the countries where this is affected. Accountability and transparency. It is a two-way accountability and transparency, both from international organizations down to national organizations. Are we being transparent in the funding, who is funding us, and what percentages are going directly to communities? Are we publishing how much of the funding that we receive is actually going to national organizations? A model that's called the SHAPE framework, the Strategic Humanitarian Assessment and Participatory Empowerment Framework. This is a competency-based self-reflection journey where local organizations, national organizations were facilitated and supported to identify their capacities and also the support that was required. We had 3 domains, and then we also had 3 competency areas. So governance, influence, and preparedness and response. And then for each of them, there were indicators that spoke to power, indicators that spoke to their humanitarian capacity and the organizational foundation. And the local organizations, national organizations were able to prepare capacity strengthening plans, self-assessed, prioritized, and now started the discussions with the international organizations. This is where we'd like you to support us. This is a journey that we'd like to go through. So for international organizations, they'll be looking at financial systems, they'll be looking at donor compliance. These are important, but possibly for the national organization, really the priority at that moment is for them to sit in the spaces where decisions are made by government. So having a discussion around what are the priorities and where we come in to support them in the journey. Communities who are most vulnerable to crises and disasters have the power to determine and lead on their own response. They are best placed to hold government to account, and I think in Kenya we really have had that discussion for many years in terms of holding government to account. Who's the voice? Who's going to speak out when resources are not allocated to disaster preparedness? Being in a context where we have recurrent droughts, and just speaking to what you're saying about what you do 5 years on, and then you have to do the same thing 5 years on, really about putting resources into resilience building and preparedness is a way to minimize or to mitigate the vulnerability of communities. We really feel localization is a means, it's not an end to itself. We might have all these partnership agreements that we revisit and work around, but if it's not going to deliver more timely, effective response to communities, then we're just, having a sideshow. The formal humanitarian system still fails to engage with and support community-based organizations, local organizations. And it's really about proximity, where the coordination mechanisms are. It's about the language that is used. It's about the technical teams that are put. So one of the things is about community plans getting recognized and funded by government as a duty bearer for disaster preparedness and response in Kenya. Local and national organizations are not able to plan long-term because funding is really, the nature of funding is still short-term. Of donors, most donors would rather work with large organizations to reduce the number of contracts that they have. So local and national organizations still do not seem to be the right vehicle for donors to invest for local organizations. But one of the things that we feel has been a key success is really the self-reflection process of local organizations, local national organizations. And so the SHAPE framework, late last year, we acknowledged that it had some gaps and listening from our national and local organizations. And so we had an attempt and a process to make the SHAPE framework work for women-led and young people's organizations. Some of the revisions that we have done is around gender and diversity, partnership, accountability, the importance of culture and values, and then considering the different circumstances and particularly looking at organizations that work in protracted crisis.
Very briefly, in terms of my background, I've spent a couple of years with the Global Child Protection AOR and the Education Cluster, looking at what localization meant within the coordination system itself. So a lot of the discussions that we've had this morning and that have been had since the World Humanitarian Summit have been about programming and how we work better with our partners and do our programs better. We wanted to explore what the coordination system should be doing to help that process as well. And this is the sort of the summary of what we discovered. We have sort of 5 areas that we think the coordination system can play a role. The first one is to look at the influence of local partners and how the coordination system can ensure that local partners have an influence over the strategic direction of the humanitarian system. That there is a fairly typical profile of what a cluster looks like, at least for education and for child protection. The green is national NGOs. Why we need to ensure that local partners can influence the discussions, because they're the ones that the cluster is ultimately representing. We looked at things like language. We know that a majority of coordination groups, about 3/4 in protection at least, are held in a language that's not English. But what language do we produce all of our global guidance? Also, in terms of membership, what we find there is there's national NGOs. We see very rarely any representation of academia, diaspora. Diaspora are a hugely important group for the humanitarian response. They understand the communities that they come from. They've got huge political influence, both in the country they're living now and back at home. And yet we very rarely even consult them when it comes to designing a humanitarian response. Every single other cluster in the world is led by international actors only, or government. And there's a proviso that government is often in some of the clusters. But in terms of civil society, there's only one in the whole world that has a national NGO leading at the national level. In child protection, there's not even a single one. The next one is partnerships. Most of predominantly, and you've heard a bit about this morning, predominantly the model of partnership at the moment is subgranting and subcontracting. We very rarely see examples of coaching, mentoring, embedding staff in local and national NGOs, joint implementation. A few of those models exist, but very rarely. And when I've travelled around, I've asked cluster groups to tell me if anyone has heard of the principles of partnership. Just a quick show of hands here, who's heard of the principles of partnership? Yeah, right, almost everyone. When I did this at country level, the maximum number of hands I got in any country was 5. For me, that's a disaster. If our partners don't even know what the principles of partnership, how on earth can they hold us accountable for adhering to the principles of partnership? And how on earth are we sure that we're applying them ourselves? The 4th one is the funding. We hear a lot about this. To be frank, it's a red herring. So this 25% that came up at the Grand Bargain, we understand the importance of a visible and a rallying point, but almost everyone that I've spoken to has told me that they don't care where the money comes from. They don't care if it drops out of the sky, if it comes through 49 layers. What they care about is when they get the money, they're able to make decisions about how to use it. Who received money at the end of the year? You'll see there the INGOs received about 70% of what they asked for. The UN received about 57% of what they asked for. The national NGOs, remembering they're the ones who were approved by the cluster, which means they've been through due diligence, they've been recommended by the child protection community, got 25% of the funding that they requested. Another quick one on funding is the 7% indirect costs that often the international community receives. I could find very few examples of where a national NGO is able to receive an indirect budget line from their international partners. Why on earth don't we give that to local NGOs? Because if they don't have that, they can't retain their staff, which we heard about this morning. They can't fix their laptop, which means that they can't do the data collection, which they're expected to do. They can't have seed funding to start a project to create a bit of credibility and prove that they can do it. They can't do their capacity building. And then finally, institutional capacity. So I've looked at I actually don't know the number. I think it's probably about 100 partnership agreements. Every single one, there'd been a partner capacity assessment that the international NGO or the UN agency asked our local partner to go through. Every single one of them. Not a single one had any budget for them to implement the recommendations of their assessment. And in fact, none of the assessments even mentioned the actual recommendations. When we design our partnership agreements, it's often the technical people, right? So if we're designing a child protection or an education partnership, it's the education section that does that. And that section is full of education professionals. But it's not full of admin specialists, HR specialists, logistics specialists. So it's kind of outside of our comfort zone. So even if we think of it, we don't know what to put in those partnership agreements. I think that's a challenge for us to start to think about when we're designing partnership agreements, and even when we're having localization discussions, is do we have those people in the room? We have this sort of very pervasive, ingrained sense of us versus them. And we do it in the way that we use language, the acronyms that we use, the insistence on using a language that we're comfortable with. We use it with the word field, because we only use that to describe other people, the recipients or the beneficiaries of aid. We don't talk about going on a business trip. That's what I do. I'm from Australia. If I travel to Sydney, I'm going on a business trip. I'm not going to the field. But for some reason, I feel perfectly comfortable saying I'm going to the field if I'm going to somewhere in Bangladesh, even if I'm going to the capital. There's a lot of structural change that we need to make, and that's going to be very difficult to do if we continue to have these very pervasive assumptions and in a lot of ways, double standards.
My name is Veronique Barbelet. I'm a researcher. I work at the Humanitarian Policy Group, which is part of the Overseas Development Institute, a think tank based in London. And I'm here with my colleague, John Bryant. And today, so we're very happy to share these findings from a project that we've been working on for the last year and a half. That's called As Local as Possible, as International as Necessary, Understanding Capacity and Complementarity in humanitarian response. And so part of this research was to try and look at some of the issues and some of the questions. In particular, what and who decides how local humanitarian action can be? Who decides when international action is necessary? And what does humanitarian action that is complementary between local and international actors look like? So through this research project, we are hoping to critically examine these questions of capacity and complementarity and inform what humanitarian action that is as local as possible, as international as necessary in a complementary manner looks like. But actually defining and assessing capacity is quite difficult. What is meant by local in local capacity is unclear, as we've discussed already. Capacity is not systematically defined in the literature on humanitarian action or in practice, and may not be actually understood the same way by different actors. Capacity gaps exist at all levels, and yet more problematic is capacity is not assessed globally in a context, in a crisis context. What you have, the practice that tends to happen, is capacity is assessed bilaterally for the purpose of either giving funding or for building a partnership. And because of that, as a result of that, the decision on who has capacity and who lacks capacity ends up in very few hands, and tends to favor an understanding and a definition of capacity that is along the line of what international humanitarian actors want to prioritize. It is also critical to recognize that in how capacity is defined, there are these different elements of power dynamics, which has led in some way to assumptions around capacity, and that is that international actors have capacity and that local actors lack the capacity. That indeed is not just about who has capacity and who lacks capacity, but it's about how you have this capacity combined and how they interact with each other. But there is very little written actually on complementarity and what complementarity between international actors and local actors mean in the humanitarian sector. Is that those current practices around partnerships and formal coordination do not necessarily support this outcome of complementarity, although there could be avenues for it. And I think it was very interesting to hear from Anthony and the work that he's doing on formal coordination, how this could be achieved better.
I think it's safe to say that in both the DRC and Bangladesh, there was no real common conceptualization of what capacity involved. So for some respondents, particularly international organizations, capacity is framed in terms of largely organizational functions, so policies and processes. So conversely, for many local organisations, operational capacity is paramount. So the ability to access affected populations and understand needs. But we also saw generally capacity understood less as the ability to deliver effective responses to affected people, and more concerned with engaging with the international system. And I think that's something that challenged a lot of what we've heard today. Local actors, in contrast, tend to have a more holistic understanding of what capacity entailed, and they could cite their own gaps in capacity a lot more readily than UN agencies and international organisations. We see, with regards to complementarity, that we're not seeing a shift currently toward a more complementary response. So instead, what we've identified are two trends. Firstly, as local and only local, so contexts where the host government and local and national actors push for exclusive control of the response, and they often use the language of the localization agenda to further this. So that was clear in the case of Bangladesh. And then conversely, what we've called as international as possible, as local as necessary, so the inverse of the Grand Bargain, where we see local organizations only really valued and their capacity only recognized in cases where international organizations can't operate, and there's little to suggest plans or a willingness to change the situation. So complementarity between local and international actors is not particularly valued or sought after. Conversely, what we see in Bangladesh is very interesting because there are effectively, one could argue that there are two parallel coordination structures in place. One's led by the Bangladeshi government and the other's led by UN actors, UN-led cluster systems. So there's a greater number of partnerships there between local and national and international actors, but they're often really just a requirement for international organizations in order to gain access to refugee camps, rather than seen as an opportunity for building a bit more of a complementary response. You know, it's important to mention government today, as I think in a lot of these discussions, the role of the host government kind of risks getting a little bit lost. What we see is an assertive government in the case of Bangladesh and a largely absent government in the case of the DRC, and that really drives at least a basic level of engagement between local and international actors. I think in Bangladesh is a really interesting example of where the Grand Bargain is being used by local and national actors basically as a stick to beat internationals over their head with and say, look, these are a set of commitments that you guys signed up to, and using the language of the Grand Bargain to drive a more localized response. By the current structure of coordination mechanisms, they don't really facilitate complementarity in a meaningful sense. And the instances where we saw local and international actors work very strongly together, they tend to happen despite not because of formal coordination mechanisms. Different actors in both the DRC and Bangladesh, they often pull in different directions, and I think that is largely a result of being ultimately responsible and accountable to different groups of people. So local NGOs in both contexts feel a real sense of responsibility and also a sense of pressure from their host communities. And international actors, to an extent, feel this as well, but they're also more accountable to donors, and they want local organizations to be accountable to them. What constitutes a local response for the host community doesn't necessarily mean one for displaced people. That's very apparent in the case of Cox's Bazar, but it's also very apparent in the case of DRC. And just discussions around capacity and complementarity, they're only really relevant insofar as they remain grounded in meeting needs and serving the needs of affected people.
How can capacity be harnessed and supported from actors that do not necessarily meet the requirement for funding and partnership? Because these are very, very important contributions to humanitarian outcomes, and yet they completely bypass. There's a lot of contradicting policies, especially among donor countries, that actually completely contradict this idea of localization. And it was interesting in DRC, speaking to one of the donors, he said, my brief coming to Eastern Kivu was larger funding to fewer organizations. And that's a signatory to the Grand Bargain and the localization workstream, completely contradicting this idea of actually a more, nebulous, more complementary way of looking at responses.